Hi everyone, this is the third video of 4 in the identification course for the summer rainfall species of Thesium, where I'll be discussing the flower and the fruit morphological characteristics. Just a quick reminder, I also did explain it in the second video. I've added some symbols to indicate the variability of the different characters. One leaf being the character is not variable within a species, and the 3 leaves being that the character is variable within a species. It's always good to keep in mind which characters show some variability. The first character relating to the flowers is the presence or the absence of a flattened disc within the flower. So here you can see there is a flattened disc at the base of the flower lobes. And in the other type, this flattened disc is completely absent, as you can see in these pictures. So these are the two types, the flower disc present or the flower disc absent. I briefly spoke about the hairiness of the flower lobes in the introduction video. And this is a very important characteristic and one of the first that we use to distinguish among species. There are 4 different types. The first type being that there are long hairs right at the apex of the flower lobes. So as you can see here, sometimes the hairs are quite dense, sometimes they're a bit more sparse, but the takeaway being that the hairs are present on the apex of the lobes, and then this is what we call bearded flower lobes. And the second type is where the flower lobes are completely smooth or glabrous, with no hairs or papilla. The third type is where the entire margin of the flower lobe is papillate, compared to the apex being hairy in the bearded flower lobes. This is the entire margin of the lobe having these papillate structures, as you can see in these photos. And then the fourth type, which is actually quite rare in the summer rainfall region, is when the flower lobes are lacinulate. So that means it's like an irregular toothed margin. It's not individual papilla, but the entire margin is sort of toothed. And an example of a species that has these lacinulate margins is Thesium anguloosum. Although it can be quite difficult to see inside of the flower or to dissect a flower, there are several very useful characteristics found on the inside of the flower. And as I said before, sometimes identification right up to species level is not possible without examining the inside of the flower. So the first character is the length of the style. So we've divided it into 2 broad types. The first being that the style is absent. So the stigma is sessile or subsessile. And this you find in species such as Thesium alatum and Thesium asterias. And the other state being that the style is present, the stigma is placed at the top of a long style. Another character relating to the style that you might come across is the position of the stigma in relation to the anthers. Although this character can be quite variable within a species, I thought it would just be good to show the placement, the different placements. So whether the stigma is placed below the anthers, in line with the anthers, or then above the anthers. Another very useful character is the position of the anthers. So whether the anthers are exerted from the flower tube or included within the flower tube. In some species, you can see the stamens are placed right at the start of the flower lobes, and then the anthers are then outside of the flower tube, placed where the flower lobes are. In other species, the stamens are placed at the bottom of the flower tube, and the anthers are then completely included in the flower tube and they do not reach up to the lobes. The last character found on the inside of the flower is the placental column shape. This is a very useful character if you are able to dissect the bottom of the flower without cutting the placental column. But with some practice that is definitely possible. So there are two different types. The first is a twisted placental column, as you can see in this drawing, and the second type is a straight placental column. Regarding the fruit, one of the useful diagnostic characters is the presence or the absence of a fruit stipe. So in the first type, there will be a very distinct fruit stipe, and in the second type, the fruits are completely sessile. No fruit stipe is present, and these prominent fruit stipes can be quite diagnostic. For example, in Thesium procerum, Thesium varmeirii, and Thesium asterias. Then there are a few characters that you might come across in some of the identification resources. The reason why I've added them right at the end is because we have found these characters to be very variable, sometimes up to the point where they're no longer useful in distinguishing between species. The first character is the presence or the absence of external glands on the outside of the flower. So there you can see these glands that alternate with the flower lobes. And we've noticed that they can vary from completely absent to very prominent within a single species. Then looking at the fruit and specifically the venation on the fruit, there are two types of veins, the first being longitudinal veins and the second being reticulate veins between the longitudinal veins. What we normally notice that in fresh fruit, the veins are, both types of veins are either absent or not very prominent, and then they become progressively more prominent as the fruit dries. The problem is with this character is that we don't know when a species was described and the fruit was described whether it was based on fresh material or on dried material. So I think it's just good to keep these characters in mind in case you do come across them in some of the identification resources. And that then concludes the third part of this course. I will continue in the next video with an identification example.